The file was thin. That was the first thing Varek noticed when the archive clerk dropped the data tablet on his desk. Most membership applications from new species ran to thousands of pages. Trade histories, military assessments, biological threat evaluations, diplomatic contact logs. The conclave was thorough. It had to be. 600 species living under one political roof required paperwork the way a star required fuel. But the human file was thin. Varek picked it up with 2 fingers, the way one might pick up something that had been sitting in the sun too long. He was a Thelvari, which meant he had 4 eyes, a long flat skull, and a professional obsession with records that bordered on religious devotion. Thin files made him uncomfortable. He opened it anyway. Humans. Homeworld, Sol 3. Common name among their own kind, Earth. Location on the galactic chart, outer fringe, Sector 9 Gamma, roughly 80,000 light-years from the conclave's political center. Their star was a small yellow dwarf, unremarkable. Their world was mostly water. They had 2 dominant sexes and 1 species of intelligent life, which was already strange. Most worlds with complex biospheres produced at least 3 or 4 competing intelligent lineages before one won out. Humans had no competition. They were alone on their world. They had applied for conclave membership 30 cycles ago. Their application had been approved with only minor debate. They were small, their fleet was modest, and their territory was so far from anything important that most member species had simply shrugged and voted yes. Varek turned the page. Their technology level at time of contact had been rated Class 4. Early faster-than-light travel, basic energy weapons, rudimentary artificial intelligence, barely enough to qualify. The conclave's minimum threshold was Class 3, so humans had scraped in with a little room to spare. He turned another page. In the 30 cycles since joining, they had advanced to Class 6. Varek stopped reading. He set the tablet down, picked it back up, and read the line again. Class 6 in 30 cycles. For context, his own species, the Thelvari, had taken 200 cycles to climb from Class 4 to Class 6. The Sulin had taken 150. The Vorkai, who were considered remarkably fast learners, had done it in 90. Humans had done it in 30. He scrolled further, looking for an explanation. War drives innovation. He knew that. Resource scarcity could accelerate development. A common external threat could push a species to leap forward. But none of those factors were present. Human space was quiet. Their borders were largely unchallenged. They had fought one minor territorial skirmish with a conclave fringe species called the Drawn, and resolved it diplomatically within a single cycle. There was no reason for the jump. It had simply happened. Varek flagged the anomaly in his notes, and kept reading. The biological section was next. Standard format, physical description, average lifespan, known medical vulnerabilities, threat assessment for contact scenarios. Humans were medium-sized bipeds, carbon-based, warm-blooded. Their average lifespan was roughly 80 to 90 standard years under natural conditions. Nothing remarkable there. Then he hit the medical section and slowed down again. Humans healed, that much was standard. All carbon-based species healed to some degree, but humans healed at a rate that the conclave's initial contact physicians had flagged as unusual. Bone fractures that would leave a Thelvari immobile for 40 days left a human walking again in 6. Soft tissue damage that would end a Vorkai soldier's career had humans back in training within weeks. There were recorded cases, documented, verified, of humans surviving injuries that the conclave's own survival probability models rated at under 3%. The medical analysts had attributed it to a highly active immune system and an unusually resilient cellular structure. They had moved on. Varek did not move on. He made another note. The history section was where things got strange. Human civilization, as recorded, was approximately 12,000 years old, young by galactic standards. What was unusual was the shape of their history. Most species followed a recognizable pattern: slow development, gradual accumulation of knowledge, steady growth with occasional setbacks from war or catastrophe. A graph of technological progress across species looked like a long, gentle slope with bumps. Humanity's graph looked like a flat line, interrupted by vertical cliffs. There were entire stretches of human history, centuries long, where almost nothing changed. No new technology, no major discoveries. Agricultural societies sitting still for 300 years at a time. And then, with no clear cause, a sudden explosion. The invention of writing, the development of mathematics, the birth of scientific thinking, the Industrial Revolution. Each leap looked less like discovery and more like remembering, like something had been locked away, and then at a specific moment, unlocked. Varric stared at the graph for a long time. He cross-referenced it with the Conclave's general xenohistory database. He was looking for other species that showed the same pattern. He found two. Both of them were extinct. He wrote a formal request to the Conclave archive for deeper access to human pre-contact history files. The raw data, the unfiltered records, whatever the original contact teams had gathered before the standard processing and summarizing. The archive responded within minutes. Access to pre-contact human history files above depth Tier 3 has been suspended pending review by the Inner Council. Authorization requires a Tier 7 clearance or above. Current clearance on file for researcher Varric Osh, Tier 4. He read the message twice. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the thin file on his desk. He had worked in the Conclave's Historical Records Division for 40 cycles. In that time he had requested restricted files 11 times. He had been denied twice, once for a classified military operation, once for sealed diplomatic correspondence between two member species in active dispute. Both times, the denial had come with a reason, a code, a reference number, a bureaucratic explanation he could trace. This denial had no reason attached, clean and flat, with no door in it. He thought about the graph, the flat lines and the vertical cliffs. He thought about the healing rates, the technology jump, the two extinct species that had shared humanity's pattern. He thought about one other thing he had almost missed, a small footnote near the back of the military section, added by a Conclave Border Patrol commander whose name he didn't recognize. The note was 3 lines long. It said that in the early years after human contact, before membership had been formalized, 2 non-member species had attempted ground operations on the human homeworld. One had been a pirate faction. One had been a minor territorial aggressor, testing the borders of what they assumed was a defenseless fringe world. Neither ground operation had produced any surviving soldiers. Neither faction had tried again. No explanation had been recorded. The Border Patrol commander had simply written, in dry official language, "Outcome unknown. Further engagement not pursued by either party." Varric closed the file. He sat in the silence of his office for a while, looking at the middle distance, doing what Felvari did when something did not add up. He thought about it slowly and carefully, from every angle, until it did. It did not add up. He opened a new document on his terminal and began writing a personal report. Not an official one, not yet. Just notes, observations, questions. At the top of the page he wrote one line. Who are these people and what is the Inner Council not telling us about them? He saved the document, locked it behind a private encryption key, and looked out his office window at the star map on the far wall. 600 species, spread across the galaxy in a great glittering net of civilization. And there, at the very edge of the map, barely a dot, barely worth marking, Sol 3. He stared at it for a long time. The dot did not look small anymore. The planet had been dead for 4,000 years. It did not look dead, exactly. From orbit it was almost beautiful. A pale brown world, wrapped in thin orange clouds, the remnants of an atmosphere that had once been breathable. Continents were still visible. The shapes of coastlines, the dry ghosts of oceans, river valleys carved into rock by water that no longer existed. If you squinted, you could imagine it alive. Dr. Mora Solon did not squint. She had been doing this long enough to see dead worlds for what they were. Tombs. She stood at the edge of the excavation trench and looked down at the exposed ruins below. Black stone mostly. The Keth had built in black stone, volcanic basalt, quarried from the mountains that ringed their major cities. Their architecture was all straight lines and sharp angles, nothing curved, nothing soft. A civilization that had built like it expected to last forever. It had not lasted. "We've cleared the lower chamber," said Toval, her Sulin excavation assistant, climbing up the metal ladder from the trench with dirt on his blue-scaled arms. "The data cores are intact, mostly. There's some crystalline decay on the outer casing of the third bank, but the inner storage should be readable." "How many cores?" Mira asked. 14, maybe 16 if the two in the corner haven't fused. She nodded and climbed down. The Joint Conclave excavation team was 23 strong, 6 species represented. Everyone from the Thalori Institute's Xenoarchaeology Division, the Thelvari Historical Commission, and 2 human researchers, Mira and her colleague Jessup, who was currently cataloging artifacts in the upper chamber and complaining loudly about the dust. The Keth had been the subject of academic study for centuries. Every spacefaring species knew the broad outline of their story. The Keth Empire had risen roughly 6,000 years ago, had dominated 2/3 of the galactic mid-rim for nearly 2,000 years, and had then simply collapsed. No plague, no war with an outside power, no asteroid impact, no gradual decline. They had been at the height of their power, and then, within 3 generations, they were gone. Their worlds went quiet. Their colonies stopped responding. Their ships stopped flying. Every 100 years or so, a new theory emerged for why. None had ever been proven. The data cores were the most complete set ever found. That was why this excavation had drawn a full joint team instead of a small survey crew. That was why the Conclave Historical Authority had fast-tracked the funding. 14 readable data cores from a Keth military installation on a core world. This was the find of the century. Mira spent the first 3 days working through the administrative records. Supply manifests, personnel logs, construction orders. Dry, careful reading, but necessary. Context made everything else make sense. On the 4th day, she reached the military operational files. The language was Old Keth, which she read well enough. The military shorthand took her a little longer to parse, but she had dictionaries. She worked slowly and carefully, the way she always did, with a pot of strong tea at her elbow and her translation software running in the background, as a backup. The first set of operational files covered campaigns she already knew about. The Keth expansion into the Dravali cluster, the pacification of the Outer Reach colonies, standard imperial military history, brutal, efficient, documented in the flat language of a civilization that had never seen a reason to apologize for anything it did. Then she found the later files, the ones dated to the last 2 centuries of the Empire. The Keth had been moving outward, expanding their territory toward the galactic fringe, sector mapping, resource surveys, standard imperial expansion doctrine. They had pushed into a region of space that the modern conclave charts labeled, simply, as the outer fringe, the same region where, 4,000 years later, a species called humanity would make their home. The Keth had called it something different. They had called it the sleeping wound. The Keth language used compound-meaning words, so she ran it through the dictionary twice to make sure she was reading it correctly. The first component meant a place of dormant danger, like a cave where a predator slept, or a river that was calm on the surface but had a killing current below. The second component was harder. It meant something between wound and unhealed thing, an injury that had scarred over but not healed properly, something that could be torn open again. The sleeping wound. She read on. The early Keth surveys of the region had been routine. Standard mapping, resource assessment, territorial flagging. But the reports started changing about 40 years into the operation. Survey ships were going quiet. Not destroyed. There was no debris, no distress signal, no sign of an attack. They simply stopped reporting. Commanders sent to investigate the disappearances came back with reports that didn't hold together. Missing time. Crew members who couldn't account for days of their lives. Navigation computers with corrupted data in segments that should have been routine. Then came the soldiers. The Keth had sent a ground force to one of the worlds in the Sleeping Wound region. A standard colonization team, heavily armed. The world was habitable, resource-rich, and apparently uninhabited. The survey had confirmed it. No intelligent life, no significant fauna, safe to settle. The ground force landed. They sent one report. It described the world as expected. Habitable, quiet, no contact. Then they stopped reporting too. The Keth sent a retrieval team. The retrieval team found the colonization camp intact, equipment still running, food still on the tables, personal belongings still in the bunks, but no soldiers, no bodies, no sign of violence, no sign of evacuation. Just gone. The Keth response had been military escalation. They were not a species that accepted mystery as an answer. They sent a full battle fleet. Mira read the fleet commander's logs carefully, translating line by line. The commander, a figure named Drath Vekin, whose name appeared in other historical records as one of the most capable military minds the Keth had ever produced, described the campaign in the Sleeping Wound with a tone that started confident and ended in something she could only describe as bewilderment. Whatever was in that region did not fight the way anything was supposed to fight. It did not have a front line. It did not have a command structure that could be targeted. It did not respond to the destruction of any single asset by weakening. It responded by changing. Every tactic the Keth tried, they could only use once. The second time they tried it, it did not work. Whatever they were fighting had learned, adapted, countered. Drath Vekin's final log entry was short. He had ordered a full retreat. He wrote, "We are not fighting an army. We are fighting something that has been hurt before, learned from every wound, and made certain it cannot be hurt the same way twice. We are not equipped for this. No one is equipped for this. I am recommending that the Sleeping Wound region be marked on all charts as permanently restricted. Future commanders should be advised, whatever lives there does not die the way things are supposed to die." The fleet retreated. The Keth marked the region restricted. And then, over the following century, the Keth Empire collapsed. Mira sat back and looked at the translated text on her screen for a long time. She thought about the modern galactic charts. She thought about where the Sleeping Wound region was located. She opened a star map on her secondary screen, cross-referenced the coordinates from the Keth records, and looked at what the modern charts showed in that location. Human space. All of it. Every star, every system, every habitable world in the region Drath Vekin had retreated from. It was all human space now. She scrolled to the end of the operational files. There was one more document, the last record created before the Keth military archive had gone silent. It was a physical description, filed by a soldier who had survived the retreat. A description of something he had seen in the Sleeping Wound, something at the edge of his ship's sensor range, before they jumped out. She read it. Then she read it again. She closed the file. Toval was across the chamber, photographing artifacts. The rest of the team was working quietly around her. No one was looking at her screen. She copied the final document to a personal encrypted drive. Then she deleted it from the shared excavation archive and replaced it with a corrupted file error marker. The kind of thing that happened all the time with 4,000-year-old data cores. She sent a private message to the human conclave liaison, a man she had never met, whose contact information had been quietly passed to her before the expedition by someone at the human embassy who had given no explanation for why she might need it. The message contained one line. "I found the Keth's last description. I think you already know what it said." She put her personal drive in her pocket, picked up her tea, and went back to work. Jessup called from the upper chamber, still complaining about the dust. Mira smiled at nothing in particular. She had been surprised by many things in her career. She was not surprised by this. She was not entirely sure why she wasn't surprised. But when she searched herself honestly, sitting in the ruins of an empire that had made the mistake of going where it shouldn't have gone, the answer she found was simple. She was human. And some part of her, deep and quiet and old, had already known. The conclave chamber was the largest room in the known galaxy. That was not an exaggeration. The hall had been built to hold representatives from 600 species simultaneously, which meant it had to be designed around 600 different ideas of what a comfortable seat looked like. 600 atmospheric preferences carefully blended into a single breathable mix, and 600 individual translation units mounted at every station. It was an engineering achievement that most species agreed was more impressive than most of the warships they had ever built. Today, it felt small. Ambassador Velith of the Filori watched the screens from her elevated gallery seat and tried to keep her breathing steady. She was good at that. Filori trained their diplomats in physical composure the way other species train soldiers in weapons. Emotion was information, and information was best given only when you chose to give it. But today was testing her. The main screens showed the Vorkai battle formation around the Sulin star system of Kelos. 47 capital ships, 12 carrier vessels, and at the center of the formation, the thing that had made the entire chamber go silent when the sensor data first came in. The Class 9 Stellar Disruptor, a weapon the size of a small moon, designed to push a star past its stability threshold and trigger a cascading nova reaction. A weapon that did not destroy a fleet, or a city, or even a planet. It destroyed the star. It destroyed everything around the star. The Sulin's home system had 6 billion inhabitants. Talks had been going on for 11 hours. The Vorkai negotiating team had spoken in the careful, patient language of a party that had already decided what it was going to do, and was simply waiting for the official record to show that it had tried otherwise. Their demands were impossible. Everyone in the chamber knew they were impossible. The Sulin had rejected them. The Vorkai had said they were sorry to hear that. 13 conclave species had pledged military support on one side or the other. The chamber had been in session without a break. 3 ambassadors had been escorted out due to medical distress. Ambassador Elena Vasquez of Humanity sat quietly at the human delegation station. She had been quiet since the session began. Humans were always quiet in the chamber. They did not speak unless directly addressed, and even then, they kept their contributions short. Some species found this strange. Most had decided it was because humanity was young and small, and appropriately humble about its limited place in galactic politics. Velith had never been entirely sure about that interpretation. She watched Vasquez now. The human woman was middle-aged, unremarkable in appearance, with dark hair pulled back from her face, and the kind of expression that gave nothing away. She was not looking at the main screens. She was looking at a small device in her hands. Velith could not see what was on it. At the 12-hour mark, when the Sulin delegation had just received a final deadline from the Vorkai fleet commander, 3 hours to comply, or the disruptor would be activated, the human delegation's request light came on. The session moderator, a Felvari named Orath, looked surprised. He looked at the human station twice, as if confirming that the light was real. Then he granted the floor, because procedure required it. Elena Vasquez stood up. She was not particularly tall. She did not have an impressive physical presence. She walked to the speaker's platform the way someone might walk to the front of a small meeting. Calmly, without ceremony. She set the device she had been holding on the podium, and looked out at the chamber. "Thank you for the floor," she said. Her voice was even. Not loud, but the translation system carried it to every station. "I'll be brief." There was absolute silence. 600 species. Not a sound. "The conclave has been in session for 12 hours, trying to find a way through this. You haven't found one. I understand that. These situations are very hard. She paused. We've seen this before. The Vorkai delegation's posture shifted. Not this exact situation, she continued, but this shape of situation. The point where two parties are locked, where force seems like the only remaining option, where someone has a weapon large enough that they believe it settles the argument. She looked at her device, then back at the chamber. We've seen what happens next. We have documentation. She pressed a single button on the device. Every station in the chamber received a file simultaneously. The conclave's internal systems confirmed receipt across all 600 delegations. The file was sealed, encrypted, with a verification signature from humanity's historical archive that allowed any recipient to independently confirm the documents were not falsified. I'm asking everyone to open the file, she said. You don't have to do anything with it right now, just look. The chamber filled with the soft sound of 600 terminals opening a document. Velith opened hers. What she found was a historical record. 7 civilizations. None of them names she recognized. None of them in the Conclave's database. Each record followed the same structure. A civilization at the height of its power, a moment of crisis with a locked conflict structure almost identical to the current one, and then what came after. The documents were not dramatic. That was what hit her hardest. They were dry, clinical, the way genuine historical records were, written by observers who had recorded facts and let the facts speak. And the facts were the same, 7 times over, with small variations. Escalation, weapons use, collapse. A civilization that had been the center of a thriving political network reduced within 2 generations to ruins that other species would later excavate and study. 7 times. The documentation was thorough, sources cited, physical evidence described, timelines reconstructed with the careful language of serious historical scholarship. Velith looked at the dates. The oldest of the 7 records was from over 300,000 years ago. She looked up. Every face in the chamber that had a readable expression was reading the document. The Vorkai delegation was very still. Elena Vasquez had not moved from the podium. I'm not making a threat, she said quietly. I want to be clear about that. I'm not telling you what will happen if you proceed. I'm showing you what has happened in similar circumstances 7 previous times. She folded her hands in front of her on the podium. The conclave can verify the documents. The verification process will take about 6 hours. I'm aware that the Vorkai deadline is 3 hours. She paused. I'm asking the Vorkai fleet commander to consider, in those 3 hours, whether he wants to be document 8. She picked up her device and walked back to her seat. The chamber remained silent for a long time. Then the moderator, Orath, found his voice. He called for a suspension of the deadline, citing the new evidence presented. The Sulan delegation agreed immediately. The Vorkai delegation asked for a recess. The recess lasted 4 hours. When the Vorkai delegation returned, their lead ambassador announced that the stellar disruptor had been stood down. The fleet had been ordered to holding position. The Vorkai were prepared to return to negotiations under a new framework. No reason was given for the change. The official statement cited a reassessment of strategic priorities in light of new information. 6 hours later, the Conclave's independent verification team confirmed that all 7 historical records in the human file were genuine. The civilizations described in them did not appear in any galactic database. They had existed before any current member species had developed spaceflight. They had collapsed completely, leaving nothing behind that the current galaxy had known to look for. The question of where humanity had obtained those records was raised in 3 separate closed sessions over the following week. It was raised carefully, with diplomatic language, and with the clear awareness that pressing too hard on the question might result in receiving an answer that nobody in the chamber was ready for. Each time it was raised, the human delegation listened politely and said that the records were part of humanity's historical archive. and had been gathered through means that were not currently classified as conclave business. No one pushed further. Velith wrote a personal report that evening. She had been a diplomat for 60 years. She had seen wars started and ended in that chamber. She had seen species broken and rebuilt. She had seen things that had kept her awake at night and things that had given her hope. She wrote, "The most frightening thing about humanity is not that they had those records. It is that when Ambassador Vasquez presented them, she did not look like someone revealing a secret. She looked like someone who had been waiting, patiently, for the right moment to remind us of something we had forgotten." She locked the report and sent it to her home government. Then she sat at her window and looked at the stars for a long time, thinking about 7 dead civilizations that had never been in any database, and a small species at the edge of the map who had somehow watched them all fall. Professor Yelani Strauchs had studied biology for 50 years. She had cataloged the cellular structures of 93 species. She had written 4 textbooks, 2 of which were currently used at universities across the conclave. She had spent 3 years studying the Vorkai immune response, which was widely considered one of the most complex biological systems in known space, and had come away from that project with a detailed paper and a healthy respect for how strange life could get. None of that had prepared her for humans. She stood in front of the research station's main display screen and looked at the data she had spent 3 months gathering. And she tried very hard to find a framework that made it make sense. She could not find one. The cell repair data was the easiest part to explain, or at least the easiest part to describe. Human cells repaired damage at a rate that was on average 4 to 6 times faster than biologically comparable species. The Sulin, who were physically similar to humans in many ways, took 3 to 4 times as long to heal the same category of injury. The Falori, her own species, took longer still. Fast healing was not unheard of. Some species had developed rapid cellular repair as an evolutionary response to hostile environments. Worlds with high radiation levels, aggressive predator populations, or extreme temperature cycles could push a species toward tougher biology over enough generations. But human evolutionary history didn't support that explanation. Earth was a reasonably stable world. Moderate temperatures across most of its surface. Lower radiation than several other inhabited worlds in the same sector. The fossil record showed that early humans had lived in dangerous conditions, large predators, disease, seasonal food scarcity, but nothing that explained biology this robust. It was as if the biology was more than the environment had required. Strauchs had flagged that in her notes, and moved on to the neurological data. She had spent 6 weeks mapping the neurochemical activity of 3 human research volunteers, all of whom had signed extensive consent forms and been remarkably cooperative. Cheerful, even, in a way she found slightly unnerving, given that she was taking biopsies of their brain tissue. What she found in those biopsies had made her sit very still for a long time. Human neurons fired in patterns she recognized. Standard carbon-based neurological activity, electrochemical signals traveling along neural pathways, synaptic connections forming and strengthening, the familiar architecture of biological cognition. All of that was normal. But layered under that normal activity, in frequencies so low they were almost not measurable, there was something else. A secondary pattern, faint, consistent, and completely outside the range of what standard carbon-based biology should be able to produce. The pattern showed quantum coherence. Quantum coherence was the property that allowed quantum systems to maintain their wave-like behavior, to exist in multiple states simultaneously, before being disrupted by interaction with their environment. It was the basis of quantum computing. It was also, in the view of every accepted theory of biological cognition, completely impossible to sustain in the warm, wet, chemically chaotic interior of a biological brain. The human brain was sustaining it. Not strongly, not consistently across all functions, but in specific cognitive states, deep concentration, high-stress problem-solving, and, most interestingly, in the moments just before and just after sleep, There were clear measurable bursts of quantum coherent activity in the human neural tissue. It was as if the human brain had two processing systems, one that thought the way brains were supposed to think, and another one that thought in a way that brains were not supposed to be able to think. Strauss had triple-checked the data. She had asked her research assistant to run independent analysis. The numbers were the same every time. She had made a note in her records. Implication unclear. Pursuing genetic analysis for supporting evidence. That had been her way of buying time while she figured out what to do with what she had found. The genetic analysis was what had broken her. Standard procedure for a species biology study was to run a full genetic lineage trace. Take the subject species genome, map it across deep time using the known rates of genetic mutation, and reconstruct the ancestral lineage back to the species' earliest biological origins. It was like unwinding a rope. The more you unwound, the further back you could see. Human genetics unwound cleanly for about 200,000 years. Their genome was consistent with a primate evolutionary history on a temperate world. It matched the fossil record. It matched the archaeological data. Everything checked out. And then at a point approximately 240,000 years in the past, the genetic thread changed. Not broke, changed. It did not become unreadable. It became different. The mutation rate shifted. The genome showed alterations that were too precise to be random. Specific sequences, modified in ways that served clear functional purposes. The cellular repair architecture, the neurological quantum layer, the cardiovascular efficiency, the immune system's unusual flexibility, all of it traced back to that single period of change, 240,000 years ago. Someone had modified the human genome. The modifications were not crude. They were not the work of a scientist trying to insert a gene and hoping for the best. They were architectural, structural. They showed an understanding of biology so deep that it made every paper Strauss had ever written look like a child's sketch. Whoever had done it had not just changed a few genes. They had redesigned the system. They had taken an existing primate species and with extraordinary precision rebuilt it into something more. Something with healing rates that exceeded its environment's demands. Something with a secondary cognitive system that shouldn't exist. Something built to last and adapt and survive in ways that went far beyond what the natural world would have produced on its own. She had stared at the data for 3 hours before she went to find Dr. Cohen Marsh, the human research liaison assigned to the study. He was a quiet man, calm and polite, with a habit of making very good tea and asking thoughtful questions about her research. She had liked him. She found him in the station's common room, reading something on a small tablet. She sat down across from him and placed her data summary on the table between them. "I need to tell you what I found," she said. He looked at the summary. He did not look surprised. He did not look alarmed. He read it carefully, in silence, the way a person reads something they have been expecting. And then he set it down and looked at her. "Yes," he said simply. She stared at him. "You knew." "We suspected. The evidence has been building for a while." He folded his hands on the table. "The modification event, the genetic shift, we've been aware of it for about 3 generations. Since we developed the sequencing technology to see it." "Then you know who did it," she said. "No," he said. "We don't. That's the part we can't figure out." He said it without frustration, without distress. He said it the way a scientist describes a problem they have been working on for a very long time and are still genuinely interested in. "We've been working on that question for about 200,000 years. We haven't cracked it yet." She sat with that for a moment. "The quantum coherence in the neural tissue," she said. "We know about that too," he said. "Most humans can't access it consciously, but it's there." He paused. "We think it's related to the modifications, part of whatever the original design intended." She looked at the table. Who could do this? The level of biological knowledge required, it's beyond anything in the conclave's scientific history. Cohen Marsh nodded slowly. "That's the other question we've been working on." She filed her report 3 days later. She included everything. The cellular data, the neurological findings, the genetic analysis, the modification event. She filed it with the Conclave's Joint Research Authority as required. The response came within hours. A member of the Conclave's highest scientific ethics board, a title she had heard of but never encountered, contacted her personally. Her study had been reclassified. She was given a new security clearance level. She was told that her research would now be handled through a different administrative channel. The board member was polite, professional, and gave no further explanation. After the call ended, Strzok sat in her office and thought about the new clearance level she had been assigned. She had not known it existed. In 50 years of Conclave-affiliated research, across 4 institutions and over 30 studies, she had never encountered it. It was not a level that had been created for her. It had been there before. It had been waiting. Someone had built a door into the Conclave's security architecture and left it ready for the day a researcher finally dug deep enough to need it. She thought about that for a long time. Then she made herself a cup of tea, the way Cohen Marsh had shown her, and sat quietly with what she had found, and thought about a species at the edge of the galaxy who did not know who made them, but had been asking the question for 200,000 years, and had not once stopped looking. The signal arrived at 3 in the morning, Conclave Standard Time. It reached the Deep Space Monitoring Network first, the array of listening stations scattered across the galaxy's outer edge, maintained by the Conclave's Communications Division. The duty officer on shift was a young Thelvari technician named Sorrel, who had been awake for 7 hours and had been thinking about his evening meal for most of them. The signal pulled him out of that thought immediately. He stared at the readout, ran a diagnostic, checked the calibration on the receiving array, ran the diagnostic again. Then he picked up his communication terminal and called his supervisor with the careful, controlled voice of someone who has just seen something that does not fit inside any category he has been trained to handle. "I need you to come to the monitoring floor," he said. His supervisor came. She looked at the readout. She called her supervisor. By the time the sun rose over the Conclave's capital station, the signal had been verified by 4 independent analysis teams, cross-referenced against every known communication pattern in the database, and confirmed as genuine. The architects were real. The Conclave Historical Division had a file on the architects. It was short, because almost nothing was known. The oldest civilizations in the Conclave, species that had been spacefaring for hundreds of thousands of years, spoke of the architects the way young children spoke of old stories. Something impossibly ancient. Something that had shaped the early galaxy the way water shaped stone, slowly, over unimaginable time, leaving marks everywhere, but never being seen. Every spacefaring species had some version of the legend. The names were different, the details varied, but the core was always the same. A civilization so old that the current galaxy was young by comparison. A civilization that had built things, changed things, designed things, and then at some point, simply stopped being visible. Not gone, just not visible. The signal was directional. That was the first detail that broke through the shock of receiving it at all. It was not a general broadcast. The trajectory calculation, when the analysis team ran it, produced a result so clear and so unambiguous that the lead analyst reported it twice before the room would accept it. The signal had been aimed at the galactic fringe, Sector 9 Gamma, human space. The emergency session of the Conclave opened within 4 hours of the signal's verification. The chamber filled faster than it ever had. Ambassadors arriving without their usual entourages. Some still in their sleep clothes. All of them with the same expression of barely controlled disbelief. The session moderator read the verified signal data. He read the trajectory analysis. He read the translation team's preliminary interpretation of the signal's content. The signal contained a name, a location, a time. The name was not a word in any known language. The translation team had spent 2 hours on it and produced a single line, a reference to the biological lineage marked in the outer fringe, approximately 240,000 years ago. The room understood what that meant. The research from Professor Strauch's had been quietly circulating among member governments for several weeks, classified, but not perfectly contained. Intelligence services were not perfectly containable. Most ambassadors in the room had at least heard the outline of what she had found. The location was beyond the edge of the official star charts, past the point where any conclave vessel had mapped. The time was 48 hours from the moment the signal was received. The chamber erupted. For 6 hours, ambassadors argued. Why humanity? Why the fringe species? Why the youngest member of the conclave, the one that had been in the Union for barely 30 cycles? The one whose homeworld was so far from the political center that most species needed a moment to find it on a map. Why not the oldest conclave members? Why not the species that had been spacefaring for 300,000 years? The arguments went in circles. No one had answers. At the 6-hour mark, the human delegation's request light came on. The chamber went quiet. That particular light on that particular station carried a weight now that it had not carried before. The room had not forgotten the stellar disruptor session. The room had not forgotten the 7 dead civilizations. When the human delegation asked for the floor, the chamber listened. Ambassador Elena Vasquez walked to the podium for the second time. She looked the same as she always did. Calm, unremarkable. The kind of face that gave nothing away. "I'm sorry to be brief again," she said, "but I will be." She looked at the chamber. 600 species, all of them waiting. The signal is not a first contact. I want the conclave to understand that. No one spoke. They are not contacting us for the first time. The silence in the chamber was different from any silence Velith had heard before. It was not the silence of people who had no questions. It was the silence of people who had too many, all arriving at once, none of them finding their way out. Vasquez stepped back from the podium and returned to her seat. The conclave voted on the response within 2 hours. There was significant debate about whether humanity should make the journey alone, whether a conclave delegation should accompany them, whether any vessel should go at all. The human delegation sat through the debate without contributing further. They had said what they came to say. The final vote gave humanity the right to respond as they saw fit. It was not a unanimous vote, but it passed. A single human diplomatic vessel left conclave space 14 hours later. It was a small ship, clean lines, no visible weapons, no large crew manifest visible on the registration. It did not carry the flags or insignia of the conclave, just humanity's own mark, a small design that most species had always considered simple and slightly plain. The conclave watched it go. Every nation in the Union had positioned observation vessels at maximum sensor range from the coordinates given in the signal. This was technically outside of what the vote had authorized, but the moderator had decided not to raise the point. Everyone understood why they were there. No one was going to sit this out. The human ship traveled for 31 hours. It passed through charted space, and then through the region of stars that appeared on no map. Not because there were no stars there, but because no one had ever gone far enough to map them. The observation vessels tracked the human ship on long-range sensors until the edge of their range, and then lost it for 9 minutes. 9 minutes of nothing. No signal, no sensor return, no data of any kind. Then the human ship reappeared on sensors, still intact, moving slowly, at a pace that suggested a deliberate return course rather than a retreat. The data that came back from the ship's sensors during those 9 minutes was transmitted to the conclave's monitoring network automatically, as part of the ship's standard data sharing protocol. The conclave's analysis teams received it within minutes of the ship's reappearance. The analysts spent 3 days with it before issuing a formal report. The report was short. The lead analyst, a Filori physicist named Var, who had 40 years of deep space data analysis behind her, had written it in a single careful paragraph that said, essentially, that the sensor data from those 9 minutes did not correspond to any known physical phenomenon. The energy readings were outside all understood parameters. The spatial geometry recorded by the ship's navigation systems showed configurations that were not possible under any accepted model of how space worked. The one piece of data that was recognizable, a simple light pattern reading, described something that produced more light in 9 minutes than most stars produced in a year. VAR had added a note at the bottom of her report, outside the official format. It said, "I have reviewed this data 17 times. I cannot explain it. I am not sure it is meant to be explained." The human ship docked at the Conclave's central station 4 days after departure. Ambassador Vasquez walked off the ship alone. She was met by the session moderator, Orath, who had apparently decided that meeting her himself was more appropriate than sending a staff member. He asked her one question, the only question anyone had. What did they say? She considered this for a moment. Many things. Most of it will take a long time to go through properly. We're going to need to talk to the Conclave's scientific bodies, the historical division, some others. She paused. But the short version? They said it was time. Time for what? Orath asked. Time to stop working in the dark, she said simply. She handed him a data drive. It was plain, small, the kind used for large format star chart files. He looked at it. New charts, she said. They extend the map a bit. We'll need to schedule some sessions to go through the implications. He turned the drive over in his hands. How far did they extend it? She thought about how to answer that. She settled on honesty, the way she usually did. About 12 times what we currently have, she said. Orath stared at her. The session that followed was not calm. It was not brief. 600 species needed time to absorb what had happened, and most of them needed considerably more time than they had. Questions were asked. Some were answered. Many were deferred. The new star charts were distributed, and immediately caused a secondary crisis of excitement, disbelief, and territorial anxiety that the Conclave's diplomatic corps would spend the next decade managing. But at one point, near the end of that first chaotic session, when the chamber was finally quiet enough for speech to carry, Ambassador Veleth of the Felori stood and asked the question that everyone in the room had been carrying since the beginning. Ambassador Vasquez, she said carefully, for 30 cycles, humanity has been a member of this conclave. In that time you have sat at the fringe of our maps, at the outer edge of everything we consider the known universe, and you have been, forgive me, small, quiet, polite, the kind of member species that most of us barely noticed. She paused. Was any of that real? The chamber waited. Elena Vasquez looked at the 600 faces looking back at her. She took a moment before she answered. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because she wanted to say it correctly. It was all real, she said. We are small. Our fleet is modest. Our territory is at the edge. We joined the conclave because we wanted to be part of this community, and we meant that. She paused. But you spent 30 cycles thinking we lived at the edge of the map. She let that sit for a moment. We were keeping the door. The chamber was very quiet. Outside, in the vast dark beyond the station's windows, the new star charts were already loading into the conclave's navigation systems. 12 times the known galaxy. 12 times the stars, the systems, the worlds. 12 times the space that had always been there, always been real, just never seen. And at the edge of the old map, in the place that most species had always treated as a footnote, a small dot marked Sol 3, barely worth noticing. A small yellow star burned the same as it always had. Patient, quiet, waiting, as it always had, for everyone else to catch up.